I've always hunted alone. There's a peace in the isolation, a simplicity in the quiet rhythm of the forest. Last fall, I decided to head to the Appalachian Mountains for a weekend hunt. The area was remote, untouched, perfect for game. But something about the forest felt off, even as I set up camp near a narrow creek. The birdsong seemed sparse, and the air carried an unusual heaviness, like a storm was brewing even though the sky was clear. The first day passed without trouble. I scouted tracks, spotted signs of deer, and felt confident. By nightfall, I was sitting by the fire, letting its warmth and crackling embers lull me into a sense of security. The stillness of the woods around me felt almost too quiet, but I brushed it off. It was probably just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. That night I woke to a sound that froze me in place, a sharp snap. Not a twig, but a branch breaking under weight. Something big was moving outside my tent. I grabbed my rifle, sitting up slowly, listening as the footsteps crunched through the underbrush. They were slow, deliberate, and heavy, too heavy for a deer. Then they stopped. Silence wrapped around me, thick and suffocating. I held my breath, straining to hear anything, and that's when I caught it, breathing. Low, ragged, and wet, like someone struggling to inhale. It was close, so close I could almost feel it through the thin nylon of my tent. My hands tightened on the rifle, slick with sweat. I wanted to move, but my body refused to cooperate, locked in place by a primal fear. The breathing shifted, moving around the tent, circling me like a predator sizing up its prey. And then it whispered. The sound was guttural, a rasping cadence that seemed to slither into my ears. At first, I thought it was gibberish, but then it almost sounded like my name, drawn out and distorted. I couldn't tell if it was one voice or many, overlapping and twisting together. My chest tightened as a wave of nausea rolled over me. I didn't just hear it. I felt it, like it was seeping into my bones. The whispering stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was somehow worse, as though the forest itself had stopped breathing. For what felt like hours, I sat there, gripping the rifle, waiting for it to return. But it didn't. At first light, I unzipped the tent slowly, stepping into the damp morning air. The forest was still unnaturally quiet. I scanned the ground and froze. There were tracks all around my tent, deep impressions in the dirt, far too large to belong to a human or any animal I knew. But the worst was the circle. A perfect ring of burnt grass surrounded my tent. The earth was blackened and brittle, as though scorched by fire. I crouched to touch it, but the ground wasn't warm. It was cold, like the life had been sucked out of it. The smell was faintly metallic, almost like blood. My stomach churned as a wave of dread washed over me. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, my hands trembling the entire time. Every step I took away from that sight felt like eyes were boring into the back of my neck, though I never saw or heard anything again. I haven't been back to those mountains, and I haven't hunted alone since. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that whisper in my dreams. It's never clear, but it always sounds the same, like something trying to speak through a mouth that wasn't made for words. I don't know what it wanted, or why it chose me, but I can't shake the feeling that I wasn't just being watched that night. I was being claimed. It was supposed to be a simple hunting trip. Just me and Eric, my best friend since childhood. We'd been hunting together for years, and this trip to northern Minnesota felt like any other. The spot we picked was deep in the woods, far from any signs of civilization. The deer stand we'd set up overlooked a clearing dotted with fresh tracks, It was perfect. But even on the first day, something about the forest felt off. The air was sharp and cold, and the usual sounds of the woods, the rustle of leaves, the chirp of birds, were missing. As we hiked to the clearing, Eric stopped abruptly. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a tree. The bark had been gouged, deep scratches cutting through it in parallel lines. They were too high for a deer or bear, and too sharp for something natural. I laughed it off, calling it wind damage, but the unease in Eric's eyes lingered. By dusk, we were in the stand, rifles ready. The sun bled red through the trees, and the temperature dropped fast, the frost clinging to every leaf and branch. We joked quietly to pass the time, but as night fell, the stillness pressed in. No owls, no crickets, just silence. "Do you hear that?" Eric whispered suddenly. I listened. Nothing. "Hear what?" "That's just it," he muttered. "There's nothing, not even the wind." I was about to tell him to stop spooking himself when we heard it. A low, guttural growl, rolling through the clearing like distant thunder. We froze, our eyes meeting in the dim light. "Wolf?" I whispered. Eric shook his head, his face pale. The growl came again, closer this time. It was too deep, too drawn out to be a wolf. My stomach tightened as my grip on the rifle grew slick with sweat. Eric clicked on his flashlight and swept the clearing. The beam illuminated frost-covered branches and dark shadows, but nothing else. "Probably just a bear," he said, though his voice was barely above a whisper. Then we heard the footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, crunching through the frozen leaves below us. Whatever it was heavy. It moved in a steady circle around the stand, staying just out of the flashlight's range. I leaned forward, heart pounding, trying to catch a glimpse of it. But the thing never came into view. Then it laughed. It wasn't a human laugh. It was a rasping, wheezing sound, like air being forced through a throat not meant to make such a noise. My blood ran cold. Eric's flashlight beam darted wildly through the trees, but the sound came from nowhere and everywhere at once. "We need to get out of here," Eric hissed, his voice shaking. We climbed down from the stand as quietly as we could, every step feeling deafening. The forest seemed to close in around us, the oppressive silence only broken by the crunch of our boots on the trail. Halfway back to the truck, Eric stopped dead. "Do you see that?" he whispered, pointing ahead. I followed his gaze and felt my stomach lurch. In the moonlight, a figure stood in the middle of the trail. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its head tilted to one side, like it was studying us. Its shadow stretched unnaturally across the ground, longer than it should have been, almost alive. The way it moved, jerky and disjointed, reminded me of a puppet on strings. My throat tightened as it took a single step toward us. We bolted. Branches clawed at our faces and rifles slammed against our backs as we tore through the woods, blind with panic. My chest burned, and every part of me screamed to stop, but I couldn't. I didn't. The only thing that mattered was getting out of those woods. When we finally reached the truck, we threw ourselves inside and locked the doors. For a long time, we just sat there, gasping for air, our breaths fogging up the windows. The forest around us was still and dark, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just beyond the headlights watching. Eric broke the silence with a shaky laugh. "Did we just get hunted?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. We never spoke about it again, and we never went back to that stand. Sometimes, though, I still see the figure in my dreams. Those long, unnatural limbs, the way its head tilted like it knew something I didn't. Eric says he sees it too. He told me once that he started hearing strange laughter outside his house at night, low and wheezing, just like in the woods. Whatever it wasn't an animal. And I'm sure as hell it wasn't human. It was supposed to be a weekend for the whole family. My dad, my Uncle Rick, my younger brother Sam, and me. A hunting trip deep in the forests of Oregon, near a ridge known locally as Hollow Ridge. Dad had hunted there for years and swore it was the best spot for deer. We arrived early Saturday morning, the mist still clinging to the trees. The woods were dense and ancient, the kind of place where time felt frozen. As we unloaded the truck, the silence hit me. No birds, no rustling leaves, just a heavy, watchful stillness. The unease began on the hike to set up camp. Sam stopped abruptly and pointed at the ground. "What made that?" he asked. In the dirt was a single print, long, narrow, with claw marks dug deep into the soil. It didn't look like anything we'd seen before. Uncle Rick glanced at it, muttered something about a bear, and kept walking, but I saw the tightness in his jaw. Then we found the tree. The bark had been shredded, deep gouges cutting through it like it had been attacked by claws the size of knives. The wounds looked fresh. "Wind damage," Uncle Rick said quickly, but none of us believed him. We set up camp in a small clearing near the ridge, trying to shake off the strange discoveries. The first day passed uneventfully. We split up to scout, but by sundown, there were no real signs of deer, just old tracks and distant rustling. The woods felt dead, like all the animals had left. As night fell, the wind picked up. It howled through the trees, twisting and shifting like a living thing. "Doesn't it sound weird?" Sam asked as we sat around the fire. "What do you mean, weird?" Dad asked. "It's not steady, it's talking." We listened, and I realized he was right. The wind didn't howl consistently. It rose and fell in strange, rhythmic patterns, almost like words forming just out of reach. "Probably just the wind whipping through the trees," Uncle Rick said, but his voice was tense. That night, as we lay in our tents, I couldn't sleep. The wind, or whatever it was, grew louder, and underneath it, I thought I heard something else. A high-pitched wail, faint but sharp enough to make my skin crawl. Around midnight, Sam shook me awake. "Do you hear that?" he whispered, his face pale in the dim light. At first I didn't. Then it came again. A scream. It wasn't human, it wasn't animal. It was something in between, rising and falling unnaturally, like it came from something in pain or something furious. Dad and Uncle Rick were already up, standing outside their tent with their rifles. "Stay here," Dad said firmly. They disappeared into the woods, their flashlights casting jittery beams through the darkness. Sam and I sat by the fire, clutching our rifles, our breaths loud in the eerie silence. Then the screams came again. Louder this time, closer. They didn't stop, each one more distorted than the last. Then we heard running. Heavy, frantic footsteps crashing through the underbrush. Sam grabbed my arm, his grip shaking, as the footsteps grew louder, heading straight for us. We braced ourselves, rifles raised, but what came through the trees wasn't what I expected. Dad and Uncle Rick burst into the clearing, their faces pale and wild. "Get to the truck," Dad barked. We didn't argue. We grabbed our gear and ran, the screams now all around us. They weren't coming from one place anymore. They were everywhere, surrounding us, echoing off the trees like the forest itself was alive. The trail back felt endless. Every step was a battle against the thick underbrush, the sound of snapping branches behind us keeping me from daring to look back. The air was thick, heavy, like it was trying to hold us in. When we finally reached the truck, we threw our gear into the bed and scrambled inside. Dad floored it, the headlights bouncing wildly over the uneven trail. As the screams faded into the distance, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still following us, just beyond the reach of the light. For a long time, none of us spoke, the tension in the truck thick enough to choke on. Finally, Uncle Rick broke the silence. "What the hell was that?" Dad didn't answer right away. He stared straight ahead, gripping the wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. "I don't know," he said finally. "But we're not going back." We never did. For weeks after, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest wasn't done with us. At night, I'd wake up in a cold sweat, the echo of those screams ringing in my ears. Sometimes I'd hear faint noises outside my window, a distant wail, or the sound of footsteps crunching leaves. Sam admitted he'd heard them too. Once, he told me he'd found scratches on the side of his house, deep gouges in the wood that looked disturbingly familiar. Whatever was out there that night, it wasn't human, and I think it wanted us to know we'd only just escaped.